Hey 8th graders, Miss Lopez here. I hope this video finds all of you doing well and safe in your homes. Um, Last week we got assigned an assignment from the district with the distance learning. And we thought it would be a good idea for us to go over it with you, seeing as how this information was new to you all. Ms. Countryman went over one of the assignments, and now I'm going to go over the assignment titled Causes of the Civil War. So bear with us, guys. This is new for all of us. And please know that we really miss you guys a lot. We miss seeing you at school, and we miss being there. This is our way of getting in contact with you guys. Let's jump right on in here. So on the first slide, we see that there are three areas. We have sectionalism, expansion of slavery, and states' rights. Now, these three issues are all connected. But as you notice, expansion of slavery has a bigger area. And our question in the middle says, how did the expansion of slavery lead to increased sectionalism and a debate over states' rights? So what we see is that as slavery begins to expand westward, it's going to create some issues. So keep in mind, people in these areas in sectionalism see themselves either as a southerner, a northerner, or a westerner. But westerners are new kids in the block. These are the ones that people either see themselves as a northerner or as a southerner. Now remember, when we talked about reformers, the reform movement was really big in the north. And one of those reform movements was the abolitionists. And they wanted to end slavery. And the thing is, the South relied on slaves on their plantations. So what we see is that Southerners start to buy up land and want to expand slavery. And they feel that it is their state right. They can decide as a state whether or not they want slavery. However, not everyone agrees, right? The Northerners say no, slavery is morally wrong. And not all Northerners, but a lot of them that are abolitionists say it's morally wrong. We shouldn't have slaves. Southerners say it's a way of life. And so as we begin to grow as a country, we see that it can lead to problems because at the present time, we see that there is a balance. And so as our country grows, we see slavery trying to be spread, and that doesn't make Northerners happy. Northerners don't like this idea of expanding slavery. They want slavery not to exist. And so this balance that has existed is going to be disrupted, and eventually it's going to lead to the Civil War that we see down here. So sectionalism, slavery, states' rights all lead to the Civil War. The second slide that you see has this North and South comparison. And so what we're seeing here is, as we're getting ready to go to war, if we had to predict who would fare better in this war, we see that there, in most categories, the North seems to be better prepared. So the North is going to have a higher population of people, 71% in comparison to the South's 29%. And population has to deal with going to war in that they have more people able to go and fight in this war. And railroads, remember during the Industrial Revolution, we see most of the railroads are going to be built in the north. That's going to play a big factor when we go into war. If you don't have a railroad, then you're going to have to rely on either horses or people just walking to get to war. And think about it, if you're walking to get to war, how exhausted are you going to be? Are you going to be able to truly fight? And so again, the North wins out because they have more railroads. They can allow their soldiers to rest. When we look at iron and steel, remember the South did not industrialize. I want you to think back when we were in the library for our industrialization simulation. Remember when we drew our pictures and we saw that on one side of our page, it grew crazy. We had a whole bunch of factories. Well, it's going to play a factor in this war. There's a lot more factories in production in the North, 92% in comparison to 8%. The South focused on agriculture. Yeah, they got cotton gins, but are cotton gins going to help in a war? And so what we see is, what are bullets made from? What else can you use iron? Okay. You can also convert these factories into making other things that you'll need for the war. Wealth, cash, money. A big percentage of people in the North have money, 75% to be exact, in comparison to 25. Wars are expensive. They're very costly. And so you're going to need your wealth. Values of exports. Remember, trading is important. Who's going to trade with you? Well, there's a lot of trade happening in the North, 68% versus 32%. In the South is primarily trading crops like tobacco and cotton. So again, that goes to wealth. We talked about factories when I talked about the iron and steel production, but look at how many factories they have. Okay. Now, when it comes to large farms, the North does not have very many large farms. They only have 16% farms. Meanwhile, the South has 84%. And farms are going to be important to feed your troops. You're going to need to feed them. You're going to have a lot of farms to feed them. So as we see the North and the South, they're getting ready to go to war. Who do you think is going to win the war? The last slide that you had basically had you kind of putting the previous slides and kind of studying them and having you answer some questions. So at the directions say, look at slide 2 to answer the questions below. Utilize the word bank to create your sentence. The first question asks, what does this show about the economic difference between the North and the South? The economy of the North and the South is very different. So what did we see about their economy? Who had more factories and what did the South have? So you could have said something to the effect like, because the North had more factories, while the South had more large farms. And so they have different economies. Remember, one based on industrialization and one based on agriculture. And so that's going to play a big factor. Now, the next question that we have says, what does the information on slide 2 reveal about the advantages and disadvantages of the North and the South? So if we look at the North, we know that they did not have... So the North had quite a bit of advantages. If we look at our word bank, we know that they had a high population. They had a lot of factories and a lot of railroads, which made them wealthy. Now, they did have some disadvantages. Remember way back at the beginning of the school year, we talked about the different colonial regions. Well, just because you're now a country doesn't mean that your climate or your weather changes or the soil. Now, what we know is that the North did not have very good soil to grow things. And we also know that their climate is very cold. And that's going to play a factor when it comes to going to war. Let's talk about the South now. Now, the South, they did have some advantages, and some of their advantages included their large farms, their climate, and their soil. However, they seem to have many disadvantages. They don't have a large population. Yes, they have slaves, but they don't have many railroads and they don't have factories. So it's going to be a challenge for them going into this war. So please note that the South is going to have other advantages, which we'll discuss later on before we get into the Civil War. But right now, we're just talking about the causes. And so tensions are rising. It's going to lead to a war, a civil war. And what makes it a civil war is that you have Americans versus Americans. And so stay tuned for more information. So one last look at our information. If you need any of this information, please make sure that you review this. This is just a summary. You don't have to turn this in. We just want you to have this information.